What if every time you went on social media, your timeline was flooded with heartbreaking news about more casualties in the very city you were born and raised in? My survivor's guilt was too vast for me to do anything about it. My name is Nasser Almanj, and I am the founder and CEO of the Youth of the War Together organization YWT, and this is my ride from a frustrated teenager to a leading youth democracy activist. YWT is a non-profit youth organization that creates online and offline safe platforms for free expression that promote democratic values and human rights.
I left Yemen in 2012 and moved to the United States. I might have moved there physically, but I remained in Yemen both mentally and virtually. And in 2015, the ongoing war began, and with it came the curbing of the already limited freedoms. The polarization was widespread. Different parties to the conflict soon began recruiting youth and installing in them ideologies that serve their agendas. The youth started to believe that the situation will never be changed through democracy and peaceful means, and the only solution for them is to get armed and go to the military fronts. So I took it upon myself to use the privilege of being an American and share some, no matter how little, of the freedom I enjoyed as a Yemeni American living in the United States. The immense drive I felt, along with the passion I have for filmmaking, and my firm belief in the power of arts, media, and culture as the most effective way to engage and activate youth for supporting democratic process and initiatives. Our very first project as the YWT was a conference we called Volunteer Talks, VTalks. The goal of VTalks was to create a platform for Yemeni volunteers to share their experiences and to promote and enhance the culture of volunteerism amongst Yemeni youth. We hosted the event 1 year after the war began to encourage the youth to live in the now, to volunteer now, and never give up or wait until the conflict is over to get started. This later became a guiding start for us at YWT. We will not start when the conflict ends, we will start to make the conflict end. We will contribute to bringing that end by creating a resilient generation capable of leading Yemen toward a brighter future. Despite VTalks being our very first project, we had a great turnout with our incredible team of volunteers. The success of that event and the impact we saw that it had on those who attended fueled our fire and made us realize how important the existence of an organization such as YWT was, and inspired us to strive to get to where we are today. Today, YWT oversees 29 projects reaching 11.4 thousand beneficiaries. We have contributed to shaping their way of thinking about human rights by engaging them in spreading the culture of democracy. We have launched several advocacy campaigns, the last of which reached over 3.8 million people in just 7 days.
One of YWT's most cherished projects is Triq24. It is an independent youth social media platform that promotes openness, accountability, and democratic ideals via the use of data visualization, fact-checking, and narrative, as well as by shedding light on important events by designing content that reflects Yemeni society today. In a country where most people get their news from social media, Triq24 is the only youth platform that has no affiliation with any political party. It uses the spoken Arabic vernacular to ensure the receptivity of audience. Over the last 2 years, Triq24 has acquired more than 50,000 followers on all its social media accounts, reaching 500,000 users, 10,000 page visits, and 11,000 account engagements per month. At Triq24, we specialize in effectively discussing taboo topics of extreme sensitivity to our conservative society in a manner that is not only engaging but also liberating, and we can quantify that based on the very human responses we receive from our audience. Here's a quote from one of our female audience members who said, and I quote, "You helped me break out of my fears and barriers of shame." We are proud of the trust we have been able to build with them and how they open their hearts to us.
Eat. I hope you had a chance to eat. And now you got new energy and get a little bit more food for thought this afternoon. We have a very interesting panel, Leaders Forum. We have a Larry Diamond. Everyone knows who he is. He'll be moderating this session. So I'm going to pass the microphone to Larry. But before I do that, please come to have a seat so that we can start the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryota. It's a pleasure to be moderating what I think will be a very inspiring session, and certainly a corrective to the notion that we are in an unambiguous and relentless democratic recession with no hope and no momentum of reversal. And I think what you'll see in this session is quite a bit is happening on the ground in supposedly deeply and stably authoritarian regimes that challenges the myth of stability and certainly legitimacy. So let me introduce the panel in the order in which I will call on them for the first round. First of all, I'd like to, and I'm going to go in order of the oldest authoritarian regime. How about that? So, of course, Cuba wins that nod today. Rosa Maria Paya is a Cuban activist for freedom and human rights and the daughter of the late great Cuban opposition leader, Oswaldo Paya, who died in a car crash in 2012 under deeply suspicious circumstances. She heads the Christian Liberation Movement, founded by her father, and is a major voice for the Cuban opposition movement, and I think an inspiration to people around the world struggling for liberation from authoritarianism. Gladys Changchireri is a Zimbabwean women's rights activist and founding director of the Institute for Young Women Development and founding coordinator of the African Women's Leaders Forum, and of course a member of the steering committee of the World Movement for Democracy and an alumna of the Reagan Fissell Fellows Program. Then we have Leopoldo Lopez, who is a leading opposition figure and former mayor in Venezuela. He'd probably be president today if Venezuela was a democracy. He spent 7 years as a political prisoner for his leadership role in organizing protests and election campaigns against the Venezuelan dictatorship. He's the national coordinator of the Voluntad Popular Party in Venezuela. He's currently a visiting fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. He's been a lecturer at Stanford Freeman Spogli Institute, but most importantly, he is now organizing the World Liberty Congress, which is a network of dissidents, pro-democracy leaders, activists from countries around the world struggling against dictatorship. And finally, Zigis Pavilionis is a former Lithuanian career diplomat. He was Lithuania's ambassador to the United States. He played a pivotal role in winning Lithuania's membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He's one of the best friends that Democrats around the world have in any NATO or European Union or Democratic Alliance country. And he's been a member of the Lithuanian parliament for over a decade now. I'll tell you how inspirational these four figures are. They have inspired me to remove my mask and enable all of us to be heard and seen more forcefully. So as I said, Rosa Maria, when we were talking before, there is a sense in the air of resignation, almost of hopelessness, that authoritarian regimes are on the march, Democrats lack arguments, they lack hope, they lack organization, and they've essentially given up in places like your country or Venezuela or Zimbabwe or Belarus or wherever it may be. But we know that's not true, and I'd like you to begin by telling us the ways in which it is not true in Cuba, and what's happening on the ground. People in this room may not know, certainly people listening to us online don't know, that is challenging the myth of authoritarian inevitability in Cuba.
Yes, that inevitability is what many has allocated as a burden over the shoulders of the Cuban people. But July 11 last year, we just witnessed a massive rise across the whole island, where hundreds of thousands of Cubans, the most part of them very young, just went into the streets demanding freedom, demanding patria y vida, which is homeland and life, as the opposite of homeland or death, which is the slogan of the Cuban communist regime, demanding the end of the dictatorship. And we are talking about the Cuban people 63 years after the Cuban Revolution, with all the weight in their shoulders of the utopian narrative of the revolution that have been sold widely, internationally, and almost by themselves, in a very precarious, in a very vulnerable situation. Even in this situation, the human beings that lives in Cuba right now are demanding that intrinsic desire that is freedom. And that's first and foremost a big opportunity for the democratic world to take the proposal, the opportunity that the people is providing and support that movement. That's also a very clear reason for hope worldwide. When we see teenagers walking by the streets, demanding freedom, being sent to 8 years in jail just for walking by the streets, and risking their lives in the pursuit of that freedom and that democracy, well, that's saying something to the international community. And that international community, being the democracies of the world, being the governments of the world, are the ones that are maybe lacking the willpower right now. I mean, civil society is ready, citizens are ready, but we need the support of the international community, and that support comes with actions, with putting your actions where your words should be.
We're going to come to the actions in a few minutes, and we're going to come to the words that they want to hear from the international community. But first, let's find out more about what's happening on the ground. So, Gladys, what are you seeing in Zimbabwe after, what, 42 years or so of authoritarian rule?
Thank you very much, Larry, for that very important, but I guess momentous question, for us as Zimbabwe. So yes, it's been 42 years, since we got political independence, and what we saw prior to independence really was the demand for democracy, the interest, the desire, to live in an open society. And post-independence, the hope was we will get there. But sadly, since the turn of the millennium, the situation has been deteriorating and further deteriorating because upon the emergence of the opposition, the major opposition since after independence, we really saw how the very state and the very people who had championed liberation became the oppressors in themselves. And, seeing how Zimbabweans felt that there was an unfinished business of liberation and that there were efforts to continuously try and entrench democracy in the country, the state has been using very different ways to really close out that space. And sadly, we got to a time where in 2017 we had a coup because the demand for democracy had increased. And it seems like, the ruling party realized that the old man that they had in Robert Mugabe was not going to be able to continuously consolidate power for them. So they overthrew him, put a new government in place, camouflaged it as, a people-driven kind of movement, but that was not the case. And up to date, we continue to see the deepening of that, authoritarian state. And as of 2020 to where we are, we've actually seen how brutal, how cruel, how shameless the government has become because they have amended the constitution. They made 27 constitutional amendments to try and take away democratic rights entrenched in the constitution that we came up with in 2017. They have come up with legislation. We're seeing the weaponization of law, where they've come up with numerous legislation to close out civic space. They want to deregister civil society organizations in the name of advancing transparency and accountability, as recommended by the Financial Task Force team. They have come up with laws to bar opposition activists who they've arrested and have at some point been convicted for, inciting public violence, demanding political rights so that they don't run for political office. I sit here today with 3 of my colleagues actually having pending court cases where they've been arrested simply for demanding young women's rights and their needs to participate in democratic spaces. And that in itself, really shows how vindictive the authoritarian state in Zimbabwe has become against the growing forces demanding democratic governance and respect of, the rights of minorities, the rights of women, and the rights of youth.
Thank you for that. And I want to come back as well to the potential levers for change in Zimbabwe. One of the things that distinguishes Zimbabwe and Venezuela, where we're coming next from Cuba, is that your 2 countries do, in theory, have multi-party elections. Elections are going to come again, it seems, in both countries. Sometimes elections can be levers for change. So Leopoldo, over to you. Let's come to the World Liberty Congress a bit later. Tell us first about what you see happening on the ground in Venezuela now and what gives you hope in terms of what lies ahead for the, quote, Bolivarian socialist regime there.
Well, thank you very much, Larry. I would like to start by the hope. We just heard this morning Eugenia from Russia, and she said something that struck me very close. She said, Russian people are not Putin. Venezuelan people are not Maduro. Cuban people are not Díaz-Canel. Chinese people are not Xi Jinping. And I think we need to understand that people in the world, regardless of where they are living, they want freedom and democracy. And this has been a conclusion in many of world surveys. People want freedom and democracy. It doesn't matter where they live. So that gives me hope. Unfortunately, movements towards democracy have been in a democratic recession, as you have noted in your research. However, people want freedom and democracy. So that poses a challenge. And hope, in a way, is also part of a challenge that we need to present to the democratic countries, to the democratic people, and to the people who want freedom and democracy. And in that sense, we need to find ways in which to channel that hope for freedom and democracy. We need to understand what has happened with the movements that have taken place in the streets of Cuba, of Zimbabwe, of Venezuela, of Belarus, of Cuba, that unfortunately, over the past years, have become less and less successful. During the 1990s, freedom revolutions or freedom movements were very successful. More than 50% of these movements led to transitions to democracy. During the turn of the century, 30% were successful. Today, less than 10% are being successful. And the answer is not that the people want less democracy and less freedom. The answer is that autocrats have decided to crush freedom movements, to crush democratic movements, and to do it in a way where they are learning from each other. So we need to find ways in which we find hope, not just amongst the people from our countries, but we find hope cross borders. We need to find hope, the Venezuelan people need to find hope in Zimbabwe, in Cuba, and in other places where there are things happening. So I do believe that there is hope. In the case of Venezuela, we have been fighting for freedom and democracy for many years now, for more than 2 decades. It's been a long fight, but it's been a fight where we've seen cycles. So at several times during these 2 decades, we've been very close, at least in the perspective, in the hopes of the people, very close to finding freedom. But then we go to a slump. So we have been in this cycle where there are peaks and then there are valleys. Now we're at a moment that we are finding ourselves in this moment of difficulties. However, we have decided, the variety of the people or the movements that are in Venezuela, to go to a primary process. And that's a good news, because we will find unity through the people, from the bottom up, through a process of primaries that will legitimize the leadership and that will give the people the say in how to articulate unity, which is, by the way, and this is another issue, but it's, by the way, a very important challenge that we all have, how to build unity within diversity of the anti-autocratic movements in each of our countries, because we all have challenges. No voice from an autocratic regime has the monopoly of their own country. I cannot talk as the only voice of the Venezuelan opposition, or anybody from Cuba, from Zimbabwe, but we need to understand that finding unity within our diversity is one of the challenges that we have. In the case of Venezuela, we have decided to find that unity from the bottom up through a process of primaries.
That is a very encouraging, indeed even elevating piece of news. Unification of the opposition, we know from the study of democratic transitions, is one of the most important conditions for success. But there's also strategy, there's also organization, there's also resources. So we'll come to all that. And there's also cross-border support. In some of those realms, I think these democracy movements probably have no better governmental friend and sympathizer now than the government of Lithuania, and no better individual friend than Zigis Paviljonis. So,
And with the European Union, why should we feed Castro dictatorship? We blocked it. Talking Taiwan, we are the only country that calls Taiwan, Taiwan, not Taipei, like most of you actually sitting here. So you can do it, but what's our Lithuanian recite? Never accommodate evil, never appease it. It leads to wars, destructions, deaths. Honestly talking, Ukraine, you know, I remember Yanukovych, Ukraine. They were playing with the devil, and they paid, and they're paying dearly now. Baltics did differently. NATO, EU rejects the Soviets, but actually even Americans, they were very clear with us. EU, NATO membership, no gray zones. No, leaving Ukrainians behind. So that's why we're talking now with Americans. We have Vilnius NATO summit approaching. Let's fix Bucharest mistakes. Let's defend that democracy, not only by words, but by our decisions. The same we talk to Swedes. high moderates, you are back on scene. You know what? Let's start accession talks with Ukrainians, on membership, not leave them like a lot of Balkan countries just with candid perspective. So a lot we can do, but we should lead. We talked about that with Ken yesterday. But that's about leadership. Every person can do a lot. Every nation can do a lot. Every regional organization. Biden can do a lot. He can be a Reagan for Ukraine. He can create Europe whole and free. That would be a historic legacy of this president that gives his whole heart to democracy. Well, maybe Reagan was like this. I was too young to remember, but let's help him create that legacy. He should do it in Vilnius, Damon. We know it. And another lesson, Lithuanian: don't trade with devils. Well, honestly speaking, who is the biggest Taiwanese partner? China. Who is the biggest EU partner? China. Who is the biggest American partner? China. Why do you feed the tigers? You did it with Russia. For 20 years, Lithuanians and Poles were begging, please don't do it. Please do it. No Nord Streams, no trades, nothing. Invest into freedom and democracy. And now they say, oh, listen to Lithuanians, like President von der Leyen said. Listen to the Baltics after 20 years of mistakes. So why do you do those mistakes with China? Why German and French leaders are going to kiss the ring of sea in 2 weeks or 1 week? It's stupid. And the same about Taiwanese. Dear Taiwanese brothers and sisters, we suffered a lot for you. Invest into Lithuania. Invest into Baltic countries. Why do you invest into China's? Why do you feed the tigers? Well, so this was about political will. But finally, I want to say also about institutions. Well, I was thinking about world democracy movement. It's okay to move, but it would be much better that we do something that we would create an organization that will be a shield of democracy. I think we are ready. More and more governments take democracy in the center of their politics. If Biden continues to lead, if out of all those democracy online meetings we build a NATO for democracy, I mean global one, kind of, you see meetings in Ramstein where 40 defense ministers are meeting and thinking how to defend Ukraine. This is how international organizations should look. This is like United Nations for Democracy should look. This was exactly what Mark Palmer, before, passing out, he said to me, Zhigis, let's fight for the world where autocracies would be abolished by international law. Let's do it, friends, before it's not too late. I would love to have an organization with Taiwan, with a lot of other nations that fight for freedom with everything they have. And then we would just win that war. So everything is in our hands.
I'm not supposed to abuse the role of the moderator here, but in a place like Ukraine, and I think we've got to be honest with ourselves, in a place like Taiwan, fighting for freedom either right now does mean literally fighting or means at least deterring fighting, and you can't do that without weapons. And there's a lesson in that, of course, that we learned in Ukraine, and I really hope we, the United States of America, are going to learn it in a more robust and resolute way for Taiwan. But now, Rosa Maria, let me come back to you, and let's get specific. You, I think, have persuaded us that there's a new generation of Cubans that are, there's a famous line in an American movie called Network, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. And I think that's what we're seeing from Iranian women. That's what we saw when the people of Belarus rose up and rallied behind the amazing woman leader who stood in for her husband, and I think everyone who knows the country knows, won the presidential election there. And we're seeing it in Cuba. But in Cuba, they're facing one of the most entrenched dictatorships in the world, with one of the largest secret police forces in the world, relative, of course, to population size. So what specifically can the United States do? Can the European Union do? How can we help the Cuban people? How can we make a difference? What do they want from us?
Thank you for that question, because it's essential. It's essential right now because, as Leo just pointed out, this peaceful, hopeful revolution that has been taking place in Cuba for more than a year now, but we have seen similar mobilization in Venezuela several times before, is a great opportunity for the international community. But if Cubans are left alone, well, dictators just learn to wait it out. Mm-hmm. And they have done that in Venezuela. They have done that, they did that in Iran before, and they may be doing it again. So United States and the rest of the democracies of the world, also the European Union, but also the democracies of the Americas that gather in the OAS, has the big opportunity of taking action not to dictate what the Cuban society should be, but to support the demand for freedom of the Cuban people. And that could be very specific. And there are precedents of success. United States, Europe, other democracies did it to support the plebiscite that ended the dictatorship of Pinochet in Chile. The world did it also to support the end of the apartheid in South Africa. And in both cases, that required a world reaction, that required corporative support, that required parliamentarian agreements in support, for instance, of sanctions for the regime of the apartheid in South Africa, and also for Chile. Well, United States, Canada, the European Union, they could make full use of the Magnitsky Act that all of them has. Okay. The European Union have a global mechanism of sanctions. We have international criminals ruling our countries. Put an end to their impunity. That is not only granted, as Anne pointed out very well, it's not only granted by the coordination of the autocracies, it's also granted by the inaction of the democracies. You could take a similar approach to the one that was taken with South Africa and invite all the companies and the corporative world also to defend human rights, to embrace Sullivan principles when they are leading with or dealing with the Cuban regime, and not just to shamefully engage in enriching the dictators over the human rights of the Cuban people. We also need their decisions, their voices in the international arena. We're talking right now, and the Iranian regime is sitting on the Commission for the Status of Women in the United Nations. We are here gathering, and Cuba is not only seated in the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations, but 2 weeks ago, the Chilean government said as a victory that they got the Cuban vote for them to be in the Human Rights Commission in the United Nations. We know they are a big power. We know that they have most of the more influent state security apparatus in the world. But the democracies are not without weapons to contrarrest that position. What we are facing is the fact that these autocracies, in the case of Cuba, totalitarian dictatorships, that are working together and coordinated have been doing so for decades now, and they have been fighting alone. So there is an opportunity now to support these freedom movements with actions as the ones that Sigis just pointed out.
And Magnitsky-style sanctions on the leaders, actions by the corporations to bring some human rights respecting principles into their activity on the ground there?
Yes, because at the end of the day, when we talk about civil society and when we talk about oppositions, when we talk about citizenry, we are talking about families against states. So you need also the support of the states. But I want to be very clear here. The protagonic role of the liberation process of our countries should be, and I think it is, on our peoples. And is, at the end of the day, what we are asking to the international community is, please listen to the people and to their demand for freedom.
And if we listened, I think we would be more powerfully moved to try and amplify their voices. Glenys, same question to you. What do you think Europe, the United States, and other sympathetic democratic actors in the world could do to help the democratic movement in Zimbabwe?
As we continue to see increased repression, in Zimbabwe, the tendency, I think, in the international community is to think that, well, why should we invest in Zimbabwe when things remain the same? Why should we invest in a country that is not making progress? But that is not true. What we see continuously happening is actually a reaction of a state that is under pressure from citizens who are demanding democracy, and they want to really close out the space and make sure that, that energy, that desire is clamped down. And for me, this is where the international community comes in to say, as citizens, as activists, women and youth continue to push back against authoritarianism and militarization as well in Zimbabwe, what role can they play to make sure that the Zimbabwean government knows that they are being watched and that the people of Zimbabwe are being supported by the whole world? This calls for the recognition of the important role of the historically marginalized groups in Zimbabwe. So I continue to argue and say the demand and desire for democracy in Zimbabwe continues to grow against all this, because historically we've learned that women and youth have been on the margins of Zimbabwean political society, of Zimbabwean civil society. But if we go back to 2018 election, that was a turning point for Zimbabwe, where we actually saw women and youth rising up, offering themselves to run for political offices, candidates, but also being the biggest voters in the country. The Zimbabwean 2018 election has actually been declared very youthful and very female, because 60% of the voters were women and youth. And really seeing the international community recognizing that role that those historically marginalized groups are playing and support them and rally behind them becomes very, very important, so that the gains that have been made thus far, 42 years into political independence from Britain, is actually not lost. Then secondly, this is a time where solidarity with the Zimbabwean people becomes more critical. We are in a state where, in a country where it's really difficult to express our freedoms in different ways. We continue to do it, but when we are closed out and forced not to demonstrate that, not to do that, we really need our international allies to be able to speak up on our behalf, to be able to show up and really be there and continuously, stand up for the people of Zimbabwe. Right now, with what's happening in the world, it's really difficult, for Zimbabwean pro-democracy society to stand with the world because of what we are facing. But that does not mean that when it's difficult for us to show up to the world, then the world should not show up for us. We need the world to be there for us. We need the US, we need the EU to hold accountable the African Union. Because when the African Union, SADC in particular, remain quiet about the situation in Zimbabwe, when clearly we've seen a military takeover and increased repression, and the EU and AU and the US are quiet about it, and China creeps in and stands with the AU, the massive support that the African Union is getting from China. What that means is an implicit endorsement of China taking over and allowing the Zimbabwean government to build allies and ties with China. Thirdly, the international community needs to come in and look at how individual activists as well as collective resilience can be built. There is nothing as tiring, as discouraging as seeing activists continuously persecuted. We've moved from a situation where we're not just being arrested, we're actually being convicted, and we're being criminals because of our work of supporting and promoting democracy, because of our demand for human rights. Real criminals, rapists, murderers, robbers, they are walking scot-free. They get presidential amnesty to get out of prisons. But the only people who are not allowed to get out of prison, out of presidential amnesty, are human rights activists, pro-democracy activists. And there's nothing that's depressing as being in that context where you continue to do this work, but the next day you are on your own. Your family is isolated, and you have to bear the consequences of your own convictions. So the request and the invitation is the international community needs to come in and support activists in Zimbabwe so that they remain resilient in the face of everything that we are facing. Because if there's one thing that we believe in as Zimbabweans, is that what we are experiencing is definitely going to end. This is a phase that we are going through, but just like colonialism was overthrown in Zimbabwe, we believe that at some point we're going to overthrow authoritarianism in Zimbabwe. So those key points for me become very important, and we need the US, we need the EU to show up to the citizens of Zimbabwe, but also to the regional borders. Southern African Development Community, when you look at what's happening in South Africa, this is where we used to look up to as Zimbabweans. But it's very sad to see South Africa degenerating into an authoritarian state. And the EU and the US remain quiet about it. When we look at what's also happening in Malawi, we looked up to Malawi. But when you look at the path they're also taking, it becomes very worrisome. And our international allies are just quiet about it. So we need you to show up to the regional sub-regional bodies as well as to the regional bodies so that the situation of Zimbabwe remains at the center of the need for peace, security, and democracy in Southern Africa as well as on the African continent at large. And I think just to echo what Hassan said earlier on, the democracy of Africa would definitely inspire democracy in Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe's democracy will inspire Africa. So if Zimbabwe remains isolated and there's no support in the country and within the region, then what we are simply promoting is what we have seen pre-independence and what we continue to experience right now.
It's a continuing democratic recession throughout Africa. Yes, thank you. Leopoldo, as you share whatever thoughts you have about what we can do in the next, when is the next election in Venezuela?
2024.
okay, in the next couple of years leading up to the next national election. Also tell us what you are trying to do with the new World Liberty Congress.
Well, your question was, what can Europe, the United States, democracies do in countries like ours that are under autocracies? And I think the first is to realize, as Anne Applebaum very clearly stated this morning, that we're not confronting particular autocracies. The Cubans, the Zimbabweans, the Venezuelans, and many other countries are not just facing our local autocrat. We're facing a network of autocracies. And I think that was very clearly exposed by Anne Applebaum this morning. And that presents a conflict in a different way. And I think that the United States and Europe need to understand that we are not talking about specific conflicts, but we are really trying to manage a network of autocracies that are feeding from each other. And understanding that should lead to a concrete agenda of what can be done, what's most effective in the way that movements can become stronger. So I would like to just share with you a couple of things. The first is that strengthening local grassroots freedom activism is critical. I mean, we can never let go of the presence of the people in the countries that are autocracies, no matter how close they are, no matter if it's as close as North Korea or places like Zimbabwe and Venezuela, as you said, that have this window of opportunity with fake or difficult elections. Well, we need to put a lot of emphasis in training, organizing grassroots, and having the capacity to have people engaging with the communities directly. Second thing is to give relevance to political prisoners. According to different studies, there are more than 100,000 political prisoners all over the world. Some people say that there might be even 1 million political prisoners all over the world. Freedom House should be coming with a study by the end of the year about the state of the world with regards to political prisoners. So showing that any country that has a political prisoner is a country that cannot be called a democracy. And I can talk very dearly to that because I was a political prisoner myself for 7 years. Third, to connect the dots with respect to kleptocracy. Anne Applebaum also talked about this morning. There is an ecosystem of autocracies with respect of their economy. Some people ask, why is Iran, Venezuela, and Russia capable of evading sanctions? Well, one of the reasons they can evade sanctions is because they have their own ecosystem. They have their own economy. They have an economy that is more inefficient, yes, that it's not as transparent, efficient as the open economy, but they have their own economy. So connecting the dots and using tools like the Magnitsky Act that goes after the corrupt and the violators of human rights is something that should be very present in the European countries and in the United States. Fourth, I believe that there are great opportunities with technology. This is an issue that you, at one point, you were talking about liberation technology. And I remember a conversation that we had a couple of months ago, and you were, in a way, frustrated with the way in which technology has evolved with respect to democracy. And true, today technology is not a tool for democratization, but the contrary. Today technology has become a tool for autocrats. However, there are many opportunities to use technology effectively in different ways for communication, but also to channeling resources going above and beyond the barriers of the financial system of autocracies. And finally, doing a global advocacy. Again, Anne Applebaum mentioned this morning. It's not the same thing that we go and advocate to Europe, to the world public opinion, to say it in a way about what's happening in Venezuela, than if we do a global advocacy. We say, this is a common struggle that we have from Venezuela, from Cuba, from Zimbabwe, from Belarus, from Russia, from Cambodia, from Burma, from Iran, from many other countries that are facing the same problem. In different languages, with different skin colors, with different religions, with different climate, but is the same issue. It's autocracy. And we need to figure out ways in which we confront this. And I think a common agenda, it's possible if we realize that this is a global struggle. Up until this point, and I think the invasion of Russia to Ukraine is definitely a turning point, or at least it's breaking before and after. It's become clear that this conflict between autocracy and democracy is global, and there needs to be, therefore, a global agenda to address the struggle. And again, I would like to always remind that the people from our countries that are living under autocracy want freedom. It is a mistake to believe that equate Venezuela to Maduro, or Putin or Russians to Putin, or Díaz-Canel to Cuban people. The people from our countries want freedom. So we need to give the tools and give the support and articulate among ourselves. And that's what we are doing with the initiative of the World Liberty Congress, which is an initiative that will take place in a couple of weeks in Lithuania. And the idea is to bring together activists, leaders from countries that are clearly autocratic, to build a working agenda, to build not a think tank, but an action-oriented agenda that can give support, and also that we can find support amongst each other, because we're fighting the same fight. And when we talk to each other, when we understand that we're fighting the same fight, we can find encouragement in understanding that we are not alone.
So you're going to fight autocracy incorporated with Democrats united?
With freedom incorporated, I believe so.
I like that. Well, Zigis, I guess we should begin by thanking Lithuania for providing a venue for the first meeting of the World Liberty Congress. But if you could react to what's been laid on the table and what you think is actionable from the standpoint of democratic governments.
Well, I think it's not enough for freedom fighters and for organizations like this to gather and talk. This is time for governments to act, to have a plan. You know, like Lithuanians, we have a plan for the little region where we maneuver for last 1,000 years. The plan is very simple. To start accession talks with Ukraine next year, to finish them in 27 during Lithuanian presidency, and to allow membership of Ukraine in 29 before new European Parliament is elected and Commission is appointed. Clear plan. But to make it success, NATO enlargement. Without this, forget it. We will spend all the money on this planet. We will, send all the weapons to Ukraine, and Russians will come and destroy it again and again and again. There is no transformation, successful transformation, without those two elements. Americans and Europeans are like a family working together. If you solve Ukraine, Moldova is done, it's solved. And actually you are solving the problem that is taking 50% of your problem. You solve Putin. Well, Lithuanian recipe is simple. Kill Putin regime during this winter. And that's done. No energy prices, no far rights taking your powers. You solve half of the world's problems. And you can do it. Just, consolidating democracy in Ukraine. Let's have another regional plan. How do you stabilize Indo-Pacific? Because just through the eyes of Lithuanian eyes, what's happening now with Taiwan, I think it's not sustainable. This is appeasement. This is appeasing China in this region. I liked American national security strategy, but one sentence that we will never recognize Taiwan independence, that makes me think, really? You send that signal? If you continue sending signals like this, they will come, grab, and occupy. It will be done. You have to make it very clear that you defend democracies, and you have a plan to defend democracies. And this is for governments to do. Don't be shy on that. Because then if you don't do it, tomorrow and after tomorrow, you will pay everything what you have in your pockets. And usually we do like this. We do it after making all possible mistakes. So better, create the future, free the future, like Reagan did. He did it. Some wise strategists looked to the Baltics and they saw the future there. In these occupied countries where 1/3 of population was annihilated, they saw the future. They defended it. And look to us. We are happy. We are rich. We are now fighting for freedom of half of the world. We challenge China. We challenge Putin. And we know that this is the only way to do it. If you want to survive, you have to fight for freedom and democracy, because it's not for granted. And this is for governments to do. So if Americans do not make their decision on NATO membership for Ukrainians, forget all the rest. And this is responsibility of this administration, of Republicans and Democrats. And I will look to their eyes in Washington. I will come to Washington after midterms and ask them, so do you do it again?
Thank you, Zigis. So I think we're in the final round here, and I'd like to see if we can keep moving the conversation in the direction of the very concrete. I think one of the most memorable phrases of the recent decades of democratic struggle will be what President Zelensky told the American government: "I don't need a ride, I need weapons." And I think it can be applied in a different context to your countries and others in the midst of peaceful struggle for democracy. Obviously, well, it may not be obvious, but the evidence shows overwhelmingly that when struggles for democracy are waged through peaceful means of nonviolent struggle, they have a much higher probability of success, unless, of course, they're attacked militarily when they're already democracies. And so what are the concrete things that would be, in some ways, a parallel to Zelensky's statement? And let me give you 2 or 3 examples. You mentioned, Leopoldo, my frustration with the lack of, it was a frustration, it wasn't despair, over the lack of progress in terms of information and communication technology. I have a hunch that we could do more on that front. I have a hunch that, you know, maybe if we really pushed it, we could find ways for citizens to communicate more safely and directly through mobile devices with the outside world in terms of getting information about what's going on, back to the outside world in terms of documenting the struggle on the streets in countries like yours, and with one another in organizing in ways that would be safe from the ferocious advance of Chinese surveillance technology. Would that make a difference or not? Or is there some other hard object or thing we could give you or transfer to you or supply you with that would make a difference? We've got to keep these answers brief, but Rosa Maria, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'm inspired by what Sigis just said, because if I have to go to the bare minimum, it's please, to the governments of the world, especially United States, EU, walk away from appeasement. Stop trying to negotiate with the oppressor. Start to extend your hands to the people, to those that are your real friends, to those that could be your partners in strengthening or building democracy in our countries. That's sadly not what we are seeing towards countries as Cuba and I would say Venezuela in this moment when we are talking about specifically United States policy. We are the generation that is experience how when you allow these regimes to grow, you end up with a war in Europe. we are the generation that is witnessing the harvest of the Cuban regime in Latin America. While the world was somehow happy, or at least quiet, with allowing this remnant of the Cold War called Cuba in the Caribbean, 30 years after that, we have seen how they ended with the democracy in Venezuela, ended with the democracy in Nicaragua, and have unleashed a wave of instability in the whole hemisphere. So the concrete call is, again, take sides with those that are really your friends, which are civil society and citizens demanding freedom.
Well, I think you've just articulated what is certainly a major and consensual takeaway from our panel. Thank you, Rosa Maria. Glenys?
You see, we're dealing with very insidious and brutal authoritarian states that, weaponize everything at their disposal. And despite the fact that they have the state machinery for surveillance, against us, the prisons to hold us and everything, I think it's important to recognize that the power still resides within people. And we may not have the physical infrastructure in countries, but we have the physical, social, political capital across countries. Cross-border solidarity and cross-movement solidarity becomes very instrumental in terms of continuously cultivating activist culture and support and promotion of democracy in countries where it's really, really difficult to promote democracy. Secondly, you mentioned, Larry, a question around what is it that the digital space can offer. The world's youth population is 1.2 billion. And within that 1.2 billion, 40% of it resides in Africa. So we're the world's youngest population. And this is the hashtag generation. And while the physical space is increasingly shrinking on the continent, we have the opportunity with the digital space. We have the opportunity to make sure that this hashtag generation finds an alternative space, an alternative voice, and it's very important for Western countries to look at how they can support and make sure that young people on the African continent have access to digital technology and space, but that is safe. Because currently, what we have, because of the current architecture in terms of political relationships and engagements on the continent, is Africa and China. And much of the digital equipment, much of the digital space that we have, that's offered by China. And the laws that our countries are putting in place are actually to complement what China is giving them. So there's really need to look at how that can be overtained and make sure that Africa's youth who hold the alternative space and energy are supported so that they are safe and they continue to do the activism that they need to do.
Great, thank you. Leopoldo?
Well, with respect of what can be done with technology, a couple of things. I think that in the communications aspect, in social media, there is a lot that can be done. For example, Maduro and all of his cronies, they have open accounts and they have access to that source, which is greatly contaminated by the influence of Russian strategies and by Chinese technology. And I think that needs to find a counterweight. It's also important to understand that there are some infrastructure needs. Access to internet, we are seeing it with Ukraine. Access to Starlink, that has been key. So we need global Starlink or whatever alternative in order to push internet into autocratic regimes. not just internet, but we also need smartphones. So we have an issue of message, we have an issue of infrastructure, and then we also have an issue of combating disinformation and fake news. But that's not the only aspect of technology. Technology, that's in respect with communications. But then there is a huge opportunity of bringing resources without the control of the financial system of autocracies. And finance and tech are a great opportunity. Cryptocurrencies are a great opportunity in that respect. There are billions of dollars going into autocratic countries, but they have to go through the financial systems that are controlled by the dictatorships. And they take away money from the people that are sending, they take away money from the people who are receiving, and they are ways today that can be done in a much more efficient and in a way that is not linked to the dictatorships. So these are two ways. One in the social media communications infrastructure, and then the other one in the financial and technology